Thank you, everyone, for being here. Welcome to this very last session of the 2026 Culture of Data Conference. My name is Grace. I'm your moderator today. Taylor Bostick is in the background, making sure everything floats smoothly, tech-wise. Um, Everyone's muted right now. Um, but at the end of our presentation, there will be time for questions. So that would be the time to unmute, raise your hand, and during the presentation, as well as during the Q&A time, please feel free to type your question into the chat. We'll make sure it gets read out loud. Um, as well, if you are, since we're all logging back in, feel free to change your Zoom name and pronouns if you like, using the three dots in the corner of your little picture face box there. We do have a sponsor for our session today, the Stedman Group. Brianna Robles is here on behalf of the Stedman Group. We couldn't put on a conference without our lovely sponsors, so they really make things like this possible. Brianna, would you like a couple minutes?
Sure. Thank you, Grace. Good morning or afternoon now, everyone. Thank you for having me. My name is Bree Robles, and as Grace said, I'm with the Stedman Group. We are a public health consulting firm that partners with communities across the country to support behavioral health planning, opioid settlement strategy, and program evaluation. So a big part of our work is helping communities use data in ways that are practical, transparent, and useful for decision making. So thank you to the conference organizers for putting this event together. We're really proud to be a sponsor. It's been great to see the conversations happening here and the range of perspectives brought into this virtual, really collaborative space. I've been popping in and out in sessions. And really one thing that stood out to me is that this conference is pushing beyond just using data to really thinking about how and why we use it. So I'm especially looking forward to going back and watching recordings of sessions I missed and also taking some learnings back to my team at Stedman Group as we sit in the intersection of data projects and community engagement. So thank you again to the organizers and to everyone contributing to these conversations. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. It's been great.
Thank you so much. All right, so our presenter today, I am super excited to learn about transforming evaluation into a reciprocal process that builds trust, strengthens community voice, and promotes healing with Indigenous frameworks. And we have our presenter here, Gerard Cozy, presenting Beyond the Metrics, Reimagining Evaluation Through Indigenous Ways of Knowing and Doing. You won't see Gerard's face on here due to some technical difficulties, but we will hear his voice. So, Gerard, take it away. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Grace. Yeah, my name is Gerard, and like Grace mentioned, a little bit of technical difficulty today. I live in a bit of a remote area, and my power's out. So I am running off my cell phone. So hopefully you folks can hear me loud and clear because the show must go on. And today we're going to talk about Indigenous evaluation frameworks, what they are, where they come from, and how they can help us move towards more equitable health outcomes. The session is grounded in respect for Indigenous knowledge systems and is intended to support thoughtful integration of those frameworks into evaluation work. If you could go to the next slide, please. Let's start off by grounding ourselves in what we'll cover in this presentation. And our objectives today are fivefold. First, we'll explore what Indigenous evaluation frameworks are at their core and how they work. Then we'll talk about their historical and cultural significance. In other words, why they emerged and what they push back against. We'll then contrast them with Western evaluation models, not to diminish either, but to understand the differences in values and approach. We'll then look at intersections, how Indigenous frameworks complement both developmental and equitable evaluation approaches. And finally, we'll end with actionable best practices for implementing Indigenous-led evaluations into all of our work. All right, with that, let's go ahead and get started. So please, next slide. And I'll start with this discussion by stating that Indigenous evaluation is not a checklist. something one can simply follow along with and neatly fill in all the boxes. It is a full-on approach, one rooted in Indigenous worldviews, values, and methodologies. And those Indigenous beliefs and worldviews are holistic in nature, context specific, and relevancy based, and above all, of course, relational. They prioritize the community's needs, values, and well being over everything else. Purpose wise, the goal isn't just to collect data for data's sake, nor is it to demonstrate the number of times a specific action was performed. It is to ensure that evaluation is community driven, ethically grounded, and functions as a tool to ensure programs are beneficial for the communities they are aimed to serve. And when done well, these frameworks foster reciprocity, promote storytelling as evidence, and reinforce the principles of data sovereignty, meaning Indigenous communities have the right to own, control, and apply their own data in ways to serve their people. Next slide, please. Now, I don't think anyone can disagree with the positive reasoning behind developing evaluation frameworks of this nature. But the real need for Indigenous evaluation frameworks is rooted in history. Colonization, as most of us know, disrupted Indigenous governance systems and knowledge sharing. And for decades, centuries really, data collection in Indigenous communities has been very extractive. Research is often conducted without consent, without context, and without benefit to the communities themselves. This research and data extraction occurred for a number of reasons. But for the purpose of this presentation, I'd like to just highlight health programs for a moment. In many cases, success or failure of a program wasn't determined by the community. In fact, these determinations involved the community very little, which begs the question, how would they even know whether these programs were beneficial? So, as a result, we've seen a powerful movement towards evaluation being performed with and by Indigenous people rather than on them as a form of self-determination. This is not just about inclusion at its roots, it was about ownership. Indigenous evaluation challenges us to rethink who gets to ask the questions, interpret the answers, and of course, shape the outcomes. Next slide, please. Now, despite these efforts, today, Indigenous communities continue to experience persistent disparities, which are deeply tied to the historical and ongoing effects of colonization, systemic racism, and underfunded systems. And oftentimes, Western evaluation frameworks fail to capture what matters most to Indigenous communities, because they don't reflect Indigenous values or lived experiences. Thus, if we truly want to create interventions that are effective and sustainable, and frankly equitable, we need evaluations that are responsive to Indigenous knowledge systems, ones that center around community strength, storytelling, and the community's lived experiences. Next slide, please. But what exactly is Indigenous evaluation? And as I mentioned earlier, Indigenous evaluation frameworks are not checklists, and they're not. However, there are 5 core principles that often appear in Indigenous evaluation frameworks. By understanding these principles, an office, a program, an entire institution can begin to weave these elements of Indigenous frameworks into pre-existing models already in use. And the first principle here is relational accountability. We need to recognize that we're not just accountable to our funding sources or our deadlines. What we really need to be accountable to is the people we work with, communities we serve, and the relationships we aim to build. Next is taking a holistic perspective, which means viewing our actions in a multitude of ways. We need to consider the mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual facets to our work and our community partners. All dimensions matter, and they're interconnected, so we need to find out ways to evaluate them. Thirdly, we have storytelling, which is central. Numbers are great, but they can't tell the whole story. Humans, not just Indigenous people, have been using stories as a communication tool for centuries, and we need to start utilizing them as the valid form of evidence that they are. And then we have reciprocity, meaning that we ensure that the evaluation process benefits the community, not just the evaluator or the institution. And when our community partners take time out of their day to provide comments or feedback that may contribute to our evaluation process, we should be looking for ways to honor their time and contributions. And finally, we must respect Indigenous knowledge systems, which are diverse, dynamic, and deserve to be honored on their own terms, not translated or reduced to fit Western categories. Now, although all of these are important, I want to point out here that this is not a zero-sum game. A program, an office, or an institution can take major strides towards effectively evaluating efforts that impact Indigenous communities by recognizing or acknowledging just one of these factors. Even every little bit counts here. We have to keep that in mind. Next slide, please. And on that note, regardless of how one might approach those principles, I'd like to share this chart that will help avoid any reduction of the validity of either type of framework. And to do so, I'd like to provide a short rundown of some of the major differences between Indigenous evaluation and Western evaluation. And in a Western model, evaluation tends to focus on objectivity, standardization, and quantifiable outcomes. There's a premium on detachment, on separating the evaluator from the evaluated. I think we can all agree that this is something we've seen before. But to quote Bob Dylan, I would like to think the times are changing. By taking a new approach to evaluation, there is an opportunity to shift away from individualism and focus on the communities we serve. And what's great about that is that it works harmoniously with Indigenous evaluation. They, in fact, reject detachment. These frameworks lean into relationships, value context, and don't try to separate the personal from the professional. Center stories and lived experiences just as much, if not more, than the numbers and the metrics. Next slide, please. So with that in mind, let's take a look at a few common Indigenous evaluation models. And the first I'd like to discuss is the medicine wheel approach, which is a powerful and widely used framework in many Indigenous cultures across North America. But despite its universality, it's important to note that it is not a one-size-fits-all model. Different tribes and nations have different interpretations, but it's consistently centered on balance and interconnectedness. As you can see here, the wheel is often divided into 4 quadrants, which represents things like the 4 directions, the 4 seasons, or the 4 aspects of the self: mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual. In evaluation, this model helps us look at the whole person, the whole community, the whole program, rather than just isolating one factor. For example, if we're evaluating a community wellness program, a medicine wheel approach would ask us to consider whether the program is not only improving physical outcomes, but also emotional resilience, spiritual connection, and mental health. Not to mention, it would push us to see the interconnectedness of all of the aspects of the program. And that's critical when we're talking about not just Indigenous well-being, but the well-being of all Coloradans. The wheel also encourages cyclical thinking. Evaluation isn't a straight line. It's a cycle of learning, reflection, growth, and then return. It is really this mindset that is so starkly different from many Western evaluation models, which tend to be linear and focused on outcomes rather than the processes. Next slide, please. On this next slide, we see the Urban Indian Health Institutes, or UIHI's, own Indigenous Evaluation Framework. Now, this organization has done some really innovative work around Indigenous evaluation, especially in urban contexts where community identity can look different than in rural or reservation settings. And in UIHI's approach, Indigenous data sovereignty is emphasized and up front and center. The idea that Indigenous people have the right to govern the collection, ownership, and application of their own data is foundational. Therefore, in this model, it truly is the communities that are determining the evaluation. They believe that too often data has been used to stereotype Indigenous communities. Thus, by ensuring data is used by and for Indigenous people, they aim to flip that narrative. They use their framework to center storytelling, community leadership, and a strength-based approach. One of their tools, for example, involves mapping community strengths before even starting a program. That way, evaluation doesn't begin with a deficit mindset. It starts with recognizing what's already working. Furthermore, UIHI trains Indigenous evaluators from within communities. This builds capacity and trust and helps ensure that evaluation methods are culturally relevant and relationally accountable. Next slide, please. And finally, we have two-eyed seeing, concept introduced by Mi'kmaq elder Albert Marshall. This model asks us to see the world through two lenses at once. One eye with the strengths of Indigenous ways of knowing, and the other with the strengths of Western science. It is, at its essence, about collaboration and not about competition. This concept has many uses, but in the context of evaluation, two-eyed seeing encourages us to bring together rigorous data analysis with storytelling, ceremony, and community context. Instead of privileging one type of evidence over another, it asks, how can both knowledge systems help us understand the full picture? This approach is especially powerful in health research and program evaluation. For instance, a community might use biomedical metrics like blood pressure or diabetes rates alongside traditional indicators of wellness, like feeling connected to land, participating in ceremony, or having strong kinship ties. In a framework like this, both kinds of data matter, and when we integrate them together, we get a much richer, more accurate sense of well-being. Two-eyed seeing also offers a practical path forward for institutions that are trying to shift to more equitable forms of evaluation. It invites us into shared learning and mutual respect, which I think could help us in our own efforts to make our offices, our programs, and our institutions' evaluation processes more equitable. Next slide, please. Okay, so now that we've seen a few evaluation frameworks in place and discussed a few practices that they use, it's time to talk application and how integration is actually possible. And I'm not going to lie to you, it's not all sunshine and rainbows. As you might expect, there are barriers to implementing Indigenous evaluation frameworks and their principles, such as colonial legacies, which have created deep mistrust. Many communities have been harmed by exploitive practices, and rebuilding that trust takes time and consistent effort. As for institutionally, many evaluation processes aren't built to accommodate Indigenous frameworks. This includes everything from how proposals are written to how outcomes are defined. One such easy example here is the preference for quantifiable data. Structurally, our systems focus on numbers, which negates the importance of storytelling that is so fundamental to Indigenous frameworks. Not to mention, there's also tension around data sovereignty. Oftentimes, folks either don't understand the concept or don't respect it. Now, I know that there have been some strides in the right direction on these fronts in acknowledgement and respect. But until we recognize that for Indigenous communities, data is a resource that must be governed accordingly to community laws and traditions, this will always be a point of contention. And finally, there's a real need for capacity building, creating pathways for scholars, evaluators, and knowledge keepers from all of the communities we serve to be trained and lead in this work. Next slide, please. Thankfully, though, we do not need to recreate the wheel here. There are already roadmaps in place that can help make the changes necessary to start integrating these evaluation principles into the work. And you're probably sick and tired of me saying this, but that starts by co-defining the purpose with the community, not for them, with them. We can also use Indigenous methods and frameworks that make cultural sense, respect both tribal sovereignty and data sovereignty, and always, always, always ask, who controls the data and who is actually benefiting from it as well. Next, one needs to ensure the process is reciprocal and giving back throughout the process, not just at the end. And this doesn't just mean monetarily. Sharing findings in culturally relevant formats, maybe through a community feast, a story bundle, or a visual installation makes data more accessible and allows communities to make decisions internally about how they'd like to proceed, regardless of what the evaluation results were. And most importantly, build in time for reflection. Evaluation isn't a set it and forget it process. It's cyclical and responsive. Next slide, please. And one of the roadmaps that I mentioned on the previous slide, one I highly recommend checking out, is the Indigenous Evaluation Toolkit, which is available online on the Seven Directions Center for Indigenous Public Health's website. The toolkit goes through the 4 phases of Indigenous evaluation adoption, which are envision and design, embark, assess progress, and celebrate and act, which all revolve around community goals. And it is full of practical tools, templates, and strategies, all created in collaboration with Indigenous practitioners. The website has also been shared as a link on the resource slide at the end of the presentation, if you're interested at all. Next slide, please. Okay, so now that we have that excellent resource in our back pocket, it's time to get practical here. I'm guessing that for some or even most of you folks, you do more than work with just tribes, tribal members, and American Indian Alaska Native communities. Therefore, I also understand that it's unlikely that any office, program, or board would wholly adopt an Indigenous evaluation framework to evaluate their entire office or program. But like I mentioned before, it doesn't have to be all or nothing. What we can do is determine which elements within these frameworks we feel could effectively demonstrate the success or failure of our work, and find ways to weave it into already established evaluation tactics. And to do so, I'd like to first discuss developmental evaluation and illuminate ways in which Indigenous evaluation principles could coexist and complement a developmental evaluation framework. And for starters, I'd like to point out that developmental evaluation allows for real-time feedback, flexibility, and adaptation, all qualities which are essential when working in community-driven settings, something that Indigenous evaluation actually requires. By layering in Indigenous principles like relational accountability and holistic well-being, we could enhance the developmental evaluation approach and make it more responsive to the communities being served. Furthermore, developmental evaluation frameworks benefit from an Indigenous evaluation data collection method, such as storytelling or photo voice, because they are an effective form of collecting real-time data, real-time feedback, and which are some of the foundational pillars to developmental evaluation. Next slide, please. Similar to developmental evaluation, equitable evaluation is also an evaluation format that has potential to fit within current evaluation practices, and it works well with Indigenous evaluation principles. For context, equitable evaluation, or EEF, is grounded in similar values as Indigenous evaluation. For instance, it challenges dominant power dynamics and centers community-defined knowledge. Thus, both equitable and Indigenous evaluation frameworks look to redefine what success looks like by emphasizing the importance of lived experiences. They both push us to ask, who gets to decide what good means, and who benefits from the work? And in order to determine the answer to these questions, both frameworks recognize and accept multiple ways of knowing and the acceptance and inclusion of multiple perspectives and worldviews. Perspectives and worldviews which might see success differently than an institution, a program, an office. And because of this, these two approaches support one another and offer pathways for evaluators and institutions to work more ethically and inclusively. Next slide, please. And lastly, we have how Indigenous evaluation and the CDC's evaluation framework can work together and not in opposition of one another. And to start, I'd like to point out that both frameworks stress the importance of community engagement. And Indigenous evaluation can complement the CDC's framework by taking it one step further and emphasizing relational accountability, which means showing up consistently, building trust, and recognizing that evaluation is a relationship, not just a process. Also, both frameworks agree that success should be defined within the community. For the CDC, this might mean public health outcomes. For Indigenous communities, it might look like language preservation. Both are valid, and through two-eyed seeing, one of the evaluation frameworks we discussed earlier, both could appear within evaluation. Furthermore, the CDC emphasizes gathering credible evidence, something Indigenous evaluation methods like storytelling are perfect for. These methods provide data that might otherwise have been missed, especially in culturally grounded programs. And finally, ethics are at the forefront of both of these frameworks. And to ensure that Indigenous communities are respected, the CDC's framework could benefit from the foundational pillars of Indigenous evaluation: tribal sovereignty and tribal data sovereignty. Next slide, please. And it is at this point that I would like to take a moment to point out that storytelling deserves its own spotlight here, because storytelling is not just a method, it's a way of knowing for Indigenous people. Many Indigenous cultures, stories are how knowledge is preserved, transferred, and taught across generations. They carry deep truths, often holistic in nature, and layered in with history, spirituality, values, and social responsibilities. And unlike Western forms of data that often require abstraction and generalization, storytelling allows for specificity and context. A single story may contain insights about health, kinship, governance, the land, spiritual teachings, and emotional resilience, all interwoven into one data set. There's no expectation to separate those things because in Indigenous worldviews, they are not separate. When we include storytelling in our evaluation, we shift the question from did it work to what did we learn? How did it feel? What changed in the community? And we create space for truths that may otherwise be lost in quantifiable only methods. Now, before I move on, let's talk a little bit about digital storytelling, because this has become an incredibly powerful 21st century evolution to traditional storytelling practices. Indigenous communities are using digital media, videos, audio recordings, animations, interactive platforms to document and share stories on their own terms. And this has opened up huge possibilities. A community can record elders' teachings in their own languages. Youth can create digital narratives that combine spoken word with imagery, sound, and music. Communities can map stories onto the land using GPS or create visual archives of cultural practices. Not to mention, digital storytelling can also be used as data in evaluation, capturing changes in self-perception, in community wellness, and in cultural connection. These stories are dynamic, engaging, and accessible. But as always, it's important to remember, even digital stories must be treated with care, consent, and respect to data sovereignty. These are not just media artifacts, they are cultural knowledge. Just because something is digital doesn't mean it's public. After all, digital information is no different than other forms of data. It too needs data security and safeguards for its collection, sharing, and stewarding. Next slide, please. And I think that's a perfect segue here for us to shift gears and discuss some of the considerations an office, a program, or an institution needs to take prior to the adoption of an Indigenous evaluation framework, or at least some of their principles. And of course, the first and most important consideration is tribal sovereignty and data sovereignty. And when we are talking about tribal sovereignty in this context, we're not just talking about governance or land rights. We are talking about the right of these communities to define their own success, ask their own questions, and to participate in the evaluation of programs impacting them, not as data points, but as the leaders. The next consideration involved with Indigenous evaluation is, of course, the ethical ones. Put it bluntly, ethics are non-negotiable. You need to start with free, prior, and informed consent, not just at the beginning of the evaluation, but throughout the entire process. There's also a need to respect cultural and intellectual property rights through tribal sovereignty and tribal data sovereignty, which means asking permission to share, interpret, and even record the stories that will so effectively assist in the evaluation process. Behind the scenes, setting up standard operating procedures or policies that respect tribal sovereignty and data sovereignty. And again, always, always, always ask who benefits from the data. If it isn't the community benefiting from the evaluation, then what you're doing is it might not be ethical, just period. Next slide. Okay, and that brings us to our final comments here, which relate to how we move forward in a good way. And up until this point, we've reviewed Indigenous evaluation principles, common frameworks already in use, ways in which to weave Indigenous evaluation efforts into Western evaluation practices, and the important considerations required when pursuing Indigenous evaluation. But what we have not shared are practical, actionable steps to integrate Indigenous evaluation frameworks. And each of the steps on this slide represents a deeper commitment to relationship, accountability, and learning. First, we have build relationships, explore values, and plan knowledge gathering collaboratively. This work starts with relationships, and it definitely does not start with transactions. Second, adapt your methods to fit Indigenous cultural contexts. Standardized methods don't always translate across cultures. Therefore, we may need to rethink the tools we use, talking about surveys, focus groups, interviews. Next, encourage feedback from an advisory committee. An Indigenous or community-based advisory group could be beneficial by providing essential guidance throughout the evaluation process. Also, prioritize Indigenous or community leadership in evaluation efforts. Whenever possible, evaluation should be led by the people. Next, establish cross-office partnerships. A truly integrated evaluation doesn't just sit in one silo or team, it crosses all the silos. 6, emphasize community voices in evaluation metric collection. Let the community define what success looks like. Don't be deterred, but this might mean redefining outcomes altogether. Next, promote tribal and tribal data sovereignty. Data sovereignty means Indigenous tribes and communities have the right to own, access, and govern their own data. And lastly, ensure long-term commitment beyond one evaluation cycle. This work cannot be done one and done. Too often, communities are asked to participate, and then they are never to be heard from again. Next slide, please. And with that, let's go ahead and wrap up the presentation on Indigenous evaluation frameworks by just taking a look at a few of those takeaways. Indigenous evaluation frameworks are cyclical, reflective, and deeply relational. They can be integrated into our current work, but we need to do so with care, attention, and humility. And lastly, the integration of Indigenous principles or an Indigenous evaluation framework does not need to be perfect. It is not an all or nothing game. We get it. We all have varying size boxes that we live in, some more flexible than others. But starting to think about these things and finding ways for this inclusion not only benefits and improves our evaluation practices, it makes them more respectful and inclusive as well. Thank you so much for your time. I will go ahead and yield the floor to any questions that anyone might have about the presentation. Also, I'd like to point out that there's some really great resources on this slide if anyone wants to take a look. I highly recommend it. Obviously, that Indigenous Evaluation Toolkit, I'm a huge fan of. Take a look for yourself.
Thank you so much, Gerard. Folks, if you have questions, please feel free to unmute, raise your hand, pop the question in the chat. I have one that can get us rolling here. You talked about this a bit, Gerard. I'm hoping we can get maybe a little more granular. A lot of our systems, our funders, the places we work, our community partners still require and want to see the standardized metrics and reporting sort of on that Western side you were talking there. I mean, you talked a little bit about tensions in holding both sides at the same time, holding the standardized metrics and reporting while trying to integrate and pull along the more relational and community-driven approaches. What have you seen there, and what sort of solutions or approaches in conversation have you found to be valuable in bringing these new ideas to a more standardized system?
Well, I think I'd like to answer that question by giving an example, and it's going to be kind of funny because I think the program leader is actually in this room right now. But I'm going to reference the Baby and You program at the state of Colorado. And they are doing a fantastic job of collaborating with myself and the Tribal Relations Unit at CDPHE to change their data collection devices to make them more, uh, I would say, beneficial to the community by utilizing community voices. And what we did was work with them to convene one of those advisory groups that I talked about on that last slide. And what that is translated into is voices from the community really dictating what questions are being asked on these surveys. And when that occurs, the answers that they're receiving back are actually going to benefit the people in these communities to a greater extent. Because prior to that, there wasn't as much culturally relevant questions being asked, especially for folks, when they live on a reservation or in tribal communities or just American Indian Alaska Native communities. They experience things differently. And I think we can all agree that different populations experience things differently altogether. But by changing the questions to be directed towards those experiences and those lived experiences, we are now collecting information that is beneficial to them. And I think that that's really the best way to do it. I would also mention just communication is key when it comes to working in some of these more Indigenous evaluation principles into our already rigid kind of the standardized metrics that you talked about. Um, just being open and transparent and making sure that, everyone has a voice at the table.
Great, thank you. Are there any other questions from the crowd? All
I
right.
take emotional outbursts as well.
Well, you did have quite a few applause. I don't know if you saw those, but um, thank you for all your work and for your presentation for us today.
No problem.
Um,
Thank you for having me.
yeah, I'm so glad it worked this whole time. Uh,
Woo.
okay, I have a couple of announcements here, but folks, as you're listening, please pop questions into the chat or unmute if something hits you. Um, Thank you so much, everybody, for attending this last session of our conference this year. Slides are available in Schedule. You can check that out. This is the QR code to our Culture of Data Evaluation Survey. We love this information. We actively use it to change things for next year. It's the first thing we do after this conference wraps is we look at this information. So please, 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 please. Um, like I said, this is our last live session. If you enjoyed this conference, please consider checking out Public Health in the Rockies. It is also put on by CPHA every year. You can look at coloradopublichealth.org for more information. Recordings from this conference will be live next week, and you'll get an email when those are ready. Thank you again for supporting CPHA and joining us in these sessions. We hope you had a lovely couple of days learning and connecting with more colleagues. And again, thank you so much, Gerard, for all of your work and for spending time with us today. Have a good night, folks.
I just wanted to make sure you guys don't need me anymore.
We're all good. Thank you so much.
Thank
Hopefully
you.
your
Really
power comes
appreciate.
back on soon.
Well, hey, yeah, no kidding. I want to just make a special thank you to you for sharing those slides. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the assist.
Of course. Have a great weekend.
You too.
Bye.